Hello everybody, thanks for joining me today. If you've seen any of my recent videos, then you've known that I've been out with the new OM System 50-200mm f2.8 lens. I've taken this lens out to a few different places and have had a lot of fun with it. Thank you so much to OM System for loaning me this lens, as well as the 1.4 and 2x teleconverters. Now the goal for this video is to basically share my results of how this lens operates, both bare and also using the 1.4 and 2x teleconverters. A lot of folks have been interested in how this lens handles the teleconverters, and there's also been a few videos already released on this topic. However, I've kind of gone through some of those videos, looked down at the comments, and kind of looked at what some viewers have still wanted answers on. And my goal for this video is to hopefully answer those questions, those unanswered questions, and kind of do some tests that maybe have not been done in other videos. Now this is probably going to be a long video. I'm going to have chapters down below. The main components of this video are going to be kind of in two different segments. So the first segment is going to be kind of, I'll call it the studio test, where I took this lens and the teleconverters in my backyard under very controlled circumstances. I had the camera and lens on a tripod, was using a timer, and was basically taking photos of a stuffed animal in the backyard, just to basically see what the image quality actually is when everything is kind of controlled in a perfect situation. And I also used my personal 150-400mm lens to basically compare the quality of the images with this lens to the 150-400mm lens, because there's a lot of crossover in focal length between this lens and the 150-400mm lens, especially when you add on the teleconverters to this lens. So I wanted to see, what was the quality of the images that you can get with this 50-200mm lens with the teleconverters, and how does it compare to the 150-400 f4.5 lens, which is a very phenomenal sharp lens. So that's going to be segment one. There's going to be a lot of comparisons, side-by-side images. I'm going to include a lot of images, comparisons in Lightroom. I'm hoping that the images come across well when you view it on YouTube. I don't know how the compression and everything is gonna work and transfer it into YouTube. Then the next second segment of the video, once we kind of go through those comparisons, is going to be I took this lens out into the field with the teleconverters, and basically we're going to see some images that I've been able to get with the teleconverters. I took it out into a marsh area and was able to just take some pictures of some Canada geese, some ducks, and that sort of thing. And we're going to basically first start with a caveat, okay? So just kind of the use of teleconverters and my thoughts on using teleconverters. Obviously, whenever you add a teleconverter to a lens, most likely in most lenses, there's going to be a little bit of a decrease in sharpness. You're going to basically add another section of glass between this lens and the camera, and typically that reduces some image quality, some sharpness. And it's just to be expected, it's just kind of common knowledge. And you also end up decreasing light when you add a teleconverter to your lens. So the 1.4 teleconverter drops one stop of light coming through the lens, so this becomes from a 2.8 lens to an f4 lens. And then when you add the 2x teleconverter to this lens, it goes from a 2.8 lens up to an f5.6 lens. Okay, so there's definitely some considerations there that you have to be worried about and thinking about when you're using teleconverters on any lens. A lot of times folks think of them as kind of just an easy way to get more reach for your focal length. And really there's nothing that beats just being able to get closer to your subject. Okay, if you can get closer to your subject, do that. Zoom with your feet is the kind of the term that a lot of people use. That's always going to get you better results, because then you can use your lens as it was designed to be made without adding any more glass to it. Obviously the benefits of teleconverters come in when there's ethical considerations involved. You legally can't get closer to your subject, or you don't want to because you don't want to disturb the subject, or in instances where you just simply can't physically get closer to your subject because there's some sort of barrier, there's some, a huge body of water, whatever the case is. For whatever reason you can't get closer to your subject, that's when teleconverters can be really useful. But the idea of, I'm just going to use a teleconverter on this lens no matter what constantly, it kind of defeats the purpose of the lens a little bit. And if that's the case, say if you need more reach because you're always photographing small songbirds, well, this lens might not be perfect for you because it goes up to 200mm, which is the field of view of 400mm. You're still going to have to get very close to your subjects in order to fill the frame with a small songbird. So perhaps it might be better for you to invest into a different lens so that you can use a lens in its native focal length rather than relying on adding teleconverters to that lens. And I hope that makes sense. It's just kind of my idea, my take on teleconverters. If you can get a lens where you can use the bare lens itself instead of having to strap on a teleconverter, you're always going to get better results, typically. Now we'll see what the results are when I add a teleconverter to this lens, and we're going to get into that right now. Now before we get into actually comparing the photos, let me just talk about the process and how I set up for the studio session of the comparison. So I took my 150 to 400 millimeter lens and the 50 to 200 millimeter lens into the background, into the backyard, set them up on tripods, and I had a little owl stuffed animal. I put that on top of a tripod, and I set myself up in 2 separate distances away from that owl, that subject, okay? Now, one of the things I noticed in the comments for other videos was a lot of folks were wondering, okay, well, how does a teleconverter act and behave, and what's image quality like when you're farther away from your subject? So in one test, I set myself up 5 meters away from the subject, which would be about 16 feet. The second distance I did was 12 meters, which is about 40 feet. Now it's still pretty close, but you more than double the distance from the subject in that case. And really, I mean, 50 feet, 40 feet, 12 meters is pretty much what you want to be at a maximum for small birds or things like that. You still need to get pretty close to your subjects. I know you can do an infinite amount of tests and distance backwards, but for this focal length and what you're using this lens for, that's kind of the distance that I would be or try to get for this lens and the focal length that it provides. Okay, so that's the 2 distances I chose, 5 meters and then 12 meters. So we're going to go through the 5 meter images first, do the comparisons, and what I did was I took a series of photos at different aperture values with the lens. I did it at f2.8, f4, f5.6, and then f8. And I did it, first test was at 150 millimeters, because that is where the initial crossover is from the 50 to 200 millimeter lens to the 150 to 400 millimeter lens. That way I could test and compare the lenses at 150 millimeters. The next test I did was at 200 millimeters. And then from there on, when adding the teleconverters to the 50 to 200 millimeter lens, the first test, when adding the 1.4 teleconverter to this lens, it becomes a 280 millimeter lens, equivalent to about a 560 millimeter lens in full frame. So I then zoomed in on the 150 to 400 millimeter lens to 280 millimeters. And then with the 2x teleconverter, again, we start at f5.6. And for this test, I did f5.6, f6.3, and then f8. Okay, so then we compared that as well to the 150 to 400 millimeter lens zoomed into 400 millimeter. I did the exact same thing again at the 12 meter different distance. And then I also did, one of the viewers mentioned that, okay, what if you use the internal digital teleconverter in the camera and compare that to the 2x teleconverter, because the digital teleconverter in the camera is a 2x crop additional on the sensor. And what do the images look like from that versus using the 2x teleconverter? So I did one little test on that, and we'll be able to see what the results are on that as well. So that would be the last test. I tested between turning image stabilization on and off because I was on a tripod, and I found I had the exact same results with image stabilization on and with image stabilization off. So for all of these tests, I did it in the beginning, for all of these, image stabilization is on. But again, I had no differences between the 2 images or the 2 with stabilization on or off. So I just left it on because that's how I shoot anyway. So the first comparison we are at with the 50 to 200 millimeter lens is going to be at 150 millimeters. And this is the 4 apertures that I shot the image at. And these images are already cropped at 100% in Lightroom. Okay, so this is not the original full-size image. These are the images already cropped in, so that hopefully we can see some detail in the subject when we zoom in even farther. This is not going to be, we're going to be very nitpicky on the detail and image quality here, okay? Now you can see right off the bat here, you can see that there's a pretty substantial difference in the background, what the background looks like, because we're changing aperture values. So up here, top left is 2.8, then we're at f4, f5.6, and then f8 here. Okay, now when basically at this view you can't really tell any difference in these images, okay? And this is at 100% crop essentially already. So we're gonna exit out of this, and we're going to end up just comparing, when I zoomed in even farther, the ones that were the sharpest in the series were the f2.8 lens and the f4 lens, or the f4 aperture, okay? So what we're going to do is kind of zoom in even farther here, all right? So on the right, we have the f4, on the left, we have f2.8 in this, and again, we're in the develop module, so we can see a little bit more detail. And when you look at these, they are very similar. Now, if you look really close, the f4 image is slightly sharper. So what I did was I focused on the eye, the right eye of the owl over here, basically as close to that white dot on the eye of the owl as I could. So that is what is going to be in the most focus. And if you look really closely on my screen at least, you can pick out a little bit more stitches in the eye of the owl in the f4 aperture. And this is at 150 millimeters, okay? So at 150 millimeters on the 50 to 200 millimeter lens, f4 aperture is the sharpest by a very small margin. Again, top left is going to be f2.8, then we're going to be f4 over here, f5.6, and then f8. Again, from what I was looking at when I looked at them a little bit further, you end up seeing that the f2.8 and the f4 lens again were the sharpest ones. We're going to put up f2.8 here on the left and f4 on the right here, and then we'll zoom in on them again. Now in this instance, at 200 millimeters, f2.8 was actually just a hair sharper. Again, you can just pick out slightly more detail in the stitches in the f2.8 image shot at 200 millimeters for this lens. Now we're going to add on the 1.4 teleconverter. So we're going to be shooting at 280 millimeters. Again, we only have 3 images to compare here because we started at f4. So up top left is f4. We have f5.6 on the top right, and on the bottom is f8. Now this is where I really started to notice something interesting. I was looking at the f5.6 images for all of these kind of images so far, of the comparison so far, and I really started to notice that f5.6 on this lens, for whatever reason, was noticeably less sharp. And it was on every series that I shot. Okay, so there was no, it wasn't because there was camera shake or anything like that. I was shooting on a timer. There was no reason why just that aperture would be less sharp for every sequence. So that was something I started to notice kind of right away. And again, in this series, this sequence, f4 was the winner again. And let's just go up. We can even, I think we can probably start to see the difference in this section. f4 is going to be on the left, and then we're going to put f5.6 on the right. And you can see, at least I can definitely see on my end, look at the right eye. The right eye on f4 is really sharp. And I also noticed that using the 1.4 teleconverter shot at f4, you get almost the same sharpness as shooting this lens at f2.8, 200 millimeters cropped in. Okay, so this is extremely sharp with the 1.4 teleconverter shot at f4. But then look at the eye at f5.6 on the right. It's blurry, it's not very sharp. For whatever reason, at f5.6, this lens does not handle as well. But when you look at the f4, you get some really, really nice results. With the 2x teleconverter on, so we're going to be shooting at 400 millimeter focal length. We're going to be starting at f5.6, which is going to be in the top left. And then we're going to be at 6.3 and then f8 down here on the bottom, okay? And again, when you're looking at all these images kind of side by side, you can't really tell much of a difference. It's when you kind of look at them side by side, you can start to really see a difference. So let's look at, we'll throw f5.6 up here on the left, and then we'll put f6.3 here on the right. And you can see with the 2x teleconverter, there's definitely a decrease in sharpness that happens. But the 5.6 on the left, you can see, again, 5.6, for whatever reason, there is a lack of sharpness in the images. 6.3 on the right here, there's slight improved sharpness. And then let's throw up f8 here on the right. And you can see at f8, there's considerably more sharpness and more detail in the eye and the stitches in the eye of the owl. So Basically, if you stop down your lens down to about f8, your sharpness really improves and increases. At least that's what I found here. Now, just to compare, I'm going to be throwing up some comparisons now with the 150 to 400 millimeter lens, so that we can, again, at the end of seeing just kind of what was the best aperture at these focal lengths, we can compare the results of the 50 to 200 millimeter lens to the results and the bests of the 150 to 400 millimeter lens. Okay. Okay, so now we are at 150 millimeters. This is again the 5 meter test. On the left, we have the 50 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens. On the right, we have the 150 to 400 millimeter f4.5 lens. The image on the left at the 50 to 200, the best one was f4.5. And then the best at the 150 millimeters for the 150 to 400 was f4.5, okay? Now, these ones, they were again very, very similar. But there was a slight edge to the 50 to 200 millimeter lens. There was a little bit more detail here in the eye. I zoomed in to about 200% to really kind of check the detail. And there was just a very slight advantage to the 50 to 200 millimeter lens at this focal length. All right, now we're going to look at 200 millimeters. Okay, so we're going to have, again, the 50 to 200 millimeter on the left, and then the 150 to 400 on the right. Now, again, very, very close. Again, I thought there was maybe just a slight advantage at 200 millimeters to the 50 to 200 millimeter lens. Again, I think this was, so on the left, the 50 to 200 millimeter lens was shot at f2.8. The 150 to 400 millimeter lens was shot at f4.5. Okay, at f2.8 at 200 millimeters, the 50 to 200 had a slight advantage of sharpness. So that was just a slight edge winner again. So we have two now images at 150 millimeters and 200 millimeters where the 50 to 200 millimeter lens has the advantage. Okay. Now, what if we add the teleconverter to the 50 to 200 millimeter lens? 1.4 teleconverter, so we're going to be shooting at 280 millimeters now. So let's throw those images up and compare them. All right, so here again on the left, we're shooting the 50 to 200 at f4, and then the 150 to 200 millimeter lens on the right is at f4.5. Now these ones, almost identical, okay? If we were going to split hairs, I would say again the advantage would possibly be to the 50 to 200 millimeter lens. Shot at f4, this lens handles the 1.4 teleconverter at f4 amazingly well. The image quality is awesome. I thought it was even almost better than just the bare lens at 2.8. That's just my opinion. So I wasn't really surprised here when comparing this focal length that the 1.4 had really good results. Now the last comparison we have between these two lenses at the 5 meter distance is at 400 millimeters, adding the 2x teleconverter to the 50 to 200 millimeter lens. On the left with the 50 to 200 2x teleconverter, we're shooting at f8. That was the best option with the teleconverter on. And then we're going to be comparing it to the 150 to 400 millimeter shot at f5.6. Okay, and this is where the advantages of the 150 to 400 millimeter really come into play. You can see it's just night and day here when comparing these two. The amount of sharpness you get with the 150 to 400 millimeter lens shot at 400 millimeters. This is where really using native glass at the focal length you need it to really has its advantages compared to just strapping on a teleconverter to a lens that doesn't quite have enough reach. You get so much more detail in the eye. You can see all the different stitches in the eye. And the one with the teleconverter on the 50 to 200, there's definitely just some softness there in the image. Again, we're shooting this. These are already cropped in 100%. We're looking at them even more cropped in. So we're splitting hairs here. But you get a lot more detail in the images with the 150 to 400 millimeter lens, shot at 400 millimeters at 5.6. So the clear winner there at 400 millimeters is the 150 to 400 millimeter lens there. Now I had another just kind of a bonus comparison here because the 50 to 200 millimeter lens uses the 1.4 teleconverter so well. I wanted to compare what about shooting this lens at 280 millimeters with the 1.4 teleconverter on at f4 and comparing that to 400 millimeters with the 150 to 400 millimeter lens and just cropping in the 50 to 200 millimeter image. Okay, so let's do that here. On the left, we have 50 to 200 millimeter lens with the 1.4 teleconverter shot at f4. And then on the right, we have 150 to 400 millimeter lens at 400 millimeters shot at 5.6. So what happens if we zoom in this image to basically kind of see what it looks like? So the image on the right is not cropped in anymore. The image on the left is zoomed in just a little bit more, and you can kind of see the eyes are roughly the same size. And even then, I would still give the edge to the 150 to 400 millimeter lens at the 400 millimeter focal length. There's just a little bit more detail there. And again, because you're able to shoot it at the 400 millimeters, you don't need to crop in as much in post, whereas you'd have to crop in pretty heavily with the 50 to 200 millimeter lens, even with the 1.4 teleconverter added to it. Okay, so there's still a slight edge, even when just comparing the lens to with the 1.4 teleconverter. All right, so that's the 5 meter test comparison. Now we're going to move back to 12 meters. I'm not going to go through the whole series of comparisons again, just so I don't want to be too redundant here. Instead, I'm just going to show you the comparisons between the two sharpest images, apertures at the distance. So we're going to start at 150 millimeters here. The 50 to 200 millimeter at 150 millimeters at f4, comparing that to the 150 millimeter to 400 millimeter lens at f4.5, which is going to be this one here on the right. I couldn't tell the difference between these two images. Very similar. Same kind of detail in the eyes, the same kind of detail in the fur on the body. You might have a slight advantage with the 50 to 200 millimeter lens because you're going to be shooting it at f4 instead of f4.5, so you get a little bit more light there. So that could be one advantage there. So we're going to go with the winner there of the 50 to 200 millimeter lens at 150 millimeters. 200 millimeters, zooming in, again on the left, we're going to have the 50 to 200 millimeter at f2.8, comparing it to the 150 to 400 at f4.5. So that's going to be the image on the right. For this, there was a slight edge to the 150 to 400 millimeter at f4.5. Just a slight improvement in the quality and the detail in the eye. But you can see with that f2.8 aperture on the left, you get a much kind of cleaner background in that image compared to the background on the f4.5 at that focal length. So you can see a much different background. So that's kind of where the difference really comes into play, and where again you might like the look of the image with the 50 to 200 millimeter lens better. If you're looking for a shallower depth of field, you can get that creamier background with that lens at f2.8 at 200 millimeters compared to the 150 to 400 millimeter lens. Okay, so let's zoom in again to 280 millimeters, the 50 to 200 millimeter lens at f4 on the left, and the 150 to 400 millimeter at f4.5 on the right. Again, for this one, there was a very slight edge to the 150 to 400 millimeter lens sharpness. For this one, the backgrounds are going to be basically the same. You're shooting at f4 on the left here and f4.5 on the right. So it's slightly shallower on the left, but detail-wise, I thought there was a little bit more sharpness in the eye with the 150 to 400 millimeter lens. So the edge goes to the 150 to 400. And then at 400 millimeter lens, this is where you're really going to see the benefits of the 150 to 400 again. So with the 50 to 200 2x teleconverter, we're going to be, the best one was at f8. So aperture of f8, that's going to be up on the left here. You can see that there's definitely some lack of sharpness there. Comparing it to f5.6 on the right with the 150 to 400 millimeter lens. And you can see it's just night and day comparing these two. The 150 to 400 millimeter lens on the right, there's just a lot more detail in the eye. You can tell the stitches in the eye, make out the detail in the stitches. The one with the 2x teleconverter on the 50 to 200, you can tell there's stitches there, but you can't really make out the detail. Okay, so definitely the benefit goes to the 150 to 400 millimeter lens. Now the last little comparison I wanted to do was using the internal digital teleconverter in the camera compared to using the 2x teleconverter externally on the lens. With the internal digital teleconverter, when you're looking through the viewfinder, you see a cropped image on the sensor. So you're looking through as if you have basically an external teleconverter on your lens, but the image that spits out and the image you look at in Lightroom is basically the full resolution file. So you again have to crop in to compare the two. Whereas when using the external teleconverter, you obviously are just getting the full resolution file of that crop using the teleconverter. Basically, in order to get the eyes to be the same size, I'm actually cropping in on the image on the right. So I switched them around. So this is the image with the external 2x teleconverter on the lens. This image on the right is the image taken with the digital teleconverter internally on the camera, okay? In order to get the same fields of view, because you get the full resolution file here, I need to crop in on this image here. And in this comparison, it was really kind of interesting because you get very similar results by cropping in basically the full size file at f2.8 compared to using the 2x crop in this instance. The benefits of using the teleconverter would be that you can then zoom in and crop in even further compared to not being able to crop in very far with the full resolution file. Okay, so that would be the benefits of actually using a 2x teleconverter externally on your lens versus relying on cropping heavily on the full size image. But you can still get really good results with just using the digital crop. Again, because you get the advantages of using f2.8 compared to the image on the left was stopped down to f8. So there's considerably less light in that image. So you may have some really nice advantages of just cropping in your f2.8 lens or your images at f2.8 at 200 millimeters compared to using the 2x teleconverter. But again, that's going to be your reference, your preference. I would probably prefer, in most cases, to put on the teleconverter because I know I can get good results around f8, or put on the 1.4 teleconverter and then crop in from there instead of having to so heavily crop in on the bare lens at 200 millimeters. But that's just my take on it. Okay, so that is it for the studio comparisons between these lenses. I'm going to put up a slide showing kind of the best results for each distance and each focal length, so you can kind of see just in one slide who the winner was and kind of the differences and conclusions there. Basically, the conclusions from this studio session was that the 50 to 200 millimeter lens is extremely sharp. Even when using the 1.4 teleconverter, you get phenomenal results at f4. You can also definitely get good results with a 2x teleconverter when you stop down your aperture down around the f8 value. I would probably prefer, personally, to just stick with the 1.4 teleconverter. It allows more light in. It definitely has phenomenal sharpness. You can crop in even further if you need to. But there are definitely instances where the 2x teleconverter is beneficial and can give you good results. So I wouldn't not use it. I would definitely use it in an instance where it warranted it. And basically, if I had at my disposal the 150 to 400 millimeter lens and I needed the reach of the 400 millimeter focal length, I would just reach for that lens. Again, use the lens that is meant and designed for that focal length and that distance compared to just relying on strapping on a teleconverter. Obviously, we all can't afford multiple lenses, so this is definitely a very useful lens for strapping on teleconverters because this gives you up to a 560 millimeter field of view in full frame by just adding the 1.4 teleconverter. So it becomes a very versatile lens that can give you phenomenal results. But again, if I needed that equivalent field of view up to about 800 millimeters or 1000 millimeters, I would reach for the 150 to 400 millimeter lens just so I can get the benefits of the f4.5 aperture. Allows more light in, I can have a faster shutter speed and all of those things. So definitely some things to think about. Very versatile lens, very interesting. The one thing that I really thought was very interesting was the lack of sharpness or the decrease in sharpness at f5.6 with this lens. That was definitely something I wasn't expecting, But something that is beneficial when you do these kinds of studio tests, I don't like doing these kinds of studio tests because I'm more of a how does it actually handle in the real world person. But this is where the benefits of doing these things just in a controlled environment come into play of, okay, well, this lens doesn't do very good at f5.6 in a controlled environment. So if I went out in the field and was shooting at f5.6 and I wasn't getting good results, I would think, okay, well, there's something wrong with what I'm doing or the lens, or there's some kind of atmospheric thing. By doing these studio tests ahead of time, you're able to know, okay, I'm going to avoid f5.6 because I'm not going to get good sharpness in those images. So it really helps you in the long run. But now let's jump into doing the real world test. So I went out to a marsh and I went to this location because I knew there was going to be at least Canada geese in this area as well as some ducks. And they usually kind of tend to float around at different distances. So I wanted to test out these lenses and compare them again with using the 1.4 teleconverter, the 2 times teleconverter, and just see what results I can get of actual real live moving subjects. I was there in the afternoon, evening, so the light was getting lower as the day went on. And we tested this lens out at different values, shutter speeds, different apertures, different ISO values. And I'm going to throw up some images here so you can really see what we can get in the real world with this lens and with the combinations. So the first subject we had was this cute little duck here. It was still pretty far away, but it was pretty cooperative most of the afternoon and was foraging relatively in front of me. This was shot at 200 millimeters on the 50 to 200 millimeter lens, f2.8, 1/800th of a second, and ISO 400. And you can see there's still some nice detail in there, even when you zoom into 100%. I'm sorry. Again, the subject's pretty far away. This would be an instance if I wanted an image like this, I'd be reaching for a different lens. But you can see that it's still a pretty decent image there. This next one, we got some Canada geese that were moving a little bit closer to us. Again, 200 millimeters, f2.8, 1/400th of a second, ISO 400. And you can see when you zoom in, you can look, there's plenty of detail in the feathers here. Plenty of detail in the eye and the head. These are really nice subjects to test the autofocus. It locked on really quickly on the head of the goose because it's just a nice black and white contrast there. So that's a nice image. Again, bear at 200 millimeters. Here's another one, 200 millimeters, f2.8. We're at ISO 2500. 1/2000th of a second. This Canada goose started to dunk under the water to preen. I was able to get a nice sequence of images. This is one of the ones that I liked because the water is just kind of beating off the top of the bird. And you can see all the water droplets on top of the bird as well. So you can see the advantage of the f2.8 really allows you to have some nice fast shutter speeds to be able to freeze motion in instances like this. And again, it just has some nice color in there as well. And these are all unedited photos. I wasn't going to go through and edit all of these because it would just take too much time. And really the benefits of this, showing just kind of what you can get right out of camera, I think is more beneficial than showing you edited photos in the end. Here's another one, 200 millimeters, f2.8, 640, 1/640 of a second, ISO 500. I kind of liked how all the geese were in a line here. You can kind of see that. Again, I was focusing on the front goose there, and you can see there's plenty of detail. I mean, it's a nice image when it's fully zoomed out like this, but when you zoom in even farther, you still have plenty of detail in the head of the bird. You can see some nice feather detail in there as well. And what about the 50 to 200 millimeter lens with the 1.4 teleconverter? What can we get there? So for that instance, this was at 280 millimeters. I'm at f8, 1/250th of a second, ISO 2500th. And for this instance, this isn't a great photo, but I included this one because it shows you how much detail you get with the 1.4 teleconverter. When you zoom in, you can see the little teeth, for lack of a better word, on the beak of the bird. You can see those little pieces where they are able to grab vegetation. That's how much detail you're able to get with this lens when you zoom in at 100%. Okay, so just really phenomenal detail with the 1.4 teleconverter. Next image again, 280 millimeters is at f4, 1/800th of a second, ISO 1250. And you can just see, I mean, the sun was going in and out. This was kind of a lower light situation, But you can see, again, not the greatest image, but you can see all the feather detail you can get, again, at this lens at f4. Just phenomenal detail in the feathers. You can see all the edges when you zoom in at 100%. Really get some nice images. And then for the next one, we had a bald eagle flying over. They're commonly in this area, and one kind of flew over and was hovering a little bit. It was still high up in the sky, but with the 1.4 teleconverter, I was able to get this image. I could have zoomed in a little bit more. I was at 260 millimeters for this image, f4, 1,250th of a second, shutter speed, and ISO 1600. It's just a nice framing of the wings that are straight out. Again, not the best image, but you can zoom in at 100% and you can still see there is some nice detail in there. Obviously, it would have been better if the eagle was a little bit lower and was actually looking up at me, but I think it was actually preening as it was flying. They ended up having a feather kind of sticking out of its chest, and I think that's what it was doing in this image. But it ended up flying off and going farther away. The next image we have, again, this duck was popping up and it came a little bit closer to me. I thought this was a nice image to show that the autofocus was working really well. So there's some vegetation in the foreground here. It could very easily trip up the camera and lock on this vegetation instead of the eye of the bird. I was using a single autofocus box with the eye detect activated so that it locked right on the head of the bird, locked onto the eye, and you can see some decent detail in there. I probably should have used a little bit slightly faster shutter speed, but that's where we're at. It was kind of paddling around pretty quickly. Next image, again, the same duck was being very cooperative. This is a nice image, just kind of right out of camera without even cropping it in. We're at 280 millimeters f4, 1600th of a second, and ISO 2500. And when you zoom in again, you can see the detail that you can get out of this. Again, I wouldn't really be cropping in 100%, but we're zooming in just to really see what the detail looks like. And then the last image, this Canada goose. Again, a nice image just right out of camera. I like the kind of reflection and the colors that are here. We're at 280 millimeters f4 again, 1600th of a second, and 2500 for ISO. And when you zoom in, you can see all the detail in the feathers. I like that the eye of the goose was closed, and you can just see all the detail that you can get with this lens with the 1.4 teleconverter. And then the last one, using the 2x teleconverter, right? So this is with the 2x teleconverter, Canada goose. They were coming a little bit closer, but they're still basically the same distance away they were before. Obviously, we have a larger animal now with the 2x teleconverter. And actually, I decided to test the 2x teleconverter in the real world at f5.6 just to see if there was any difference with the sharpness and such. And you can see when you're looking at the full-size image, f5.6 still gives you plenty of detail in the bird. When you look in and zoom in at 100% in Lightroom, you can see that there is kind of a lack of sharpness around the eye. But again, if you're going to be cropping in an image that has a 2x teleconverter, it might be time to think about getting a lens with a longer native focal length if you're looking for those really close-up portrait shots. When you're looking at this image full size, you still have plenty of detail in there to work with at the 2x with the 2x teleconverter. Again, this was another example at f5.6. We're at 400 millimeters, 1/320th of a second, because again we had to drop down our shutter speed to try to keep our ISO similar, because we need there's less light coming through the lens with the 2x teleconverter. And then this one I thought was actually pretty sharp at f5.6. Sharper than what I kind of saw with the tests in the background, in the backyard. Cropped in or zoomed in 100% here, you can still make out some nice detail around the eye of the animal. And again, at full size, there's plenty of detail here as well. Now, I bumped it up to f8 for this image because I knew that f8 was giving me the best results in the backyard with the 2x teleconverter. So here we're at f8, where we had to drop down our shutter speed all the way down to 1/160th of a second, which was doable for these animals because they were moving very slowly, if moving at all, on the surface of the water. And you can see when you zoom in here, there is a little bit better image quality, some better results on the eye compared to the 5.6 example, which is here. but not very noticeable. So if you're really struggling with low light, I wouldn't hesitate to use 5.6 if you need to. When you're looking at the images full size, you definitely have a nice enough image to look at. Again, f8, this one was nice because the sun kind of peeked through, so we were able to see, have a little bit more light. I was able to bump up my shutter speed to 640th of a second. ISO is still 4000, but you can see that there's still plenty of detail in the subject here for this image. And then the last one, again at f8, 400 millimeters, and I was at 1/500th of a second. There was a goose that had been preening for a while. I was waiting for it to flap its wings, and I finally kind of was able to quickly move my camera over and take this photo. This is an example where you can still get some frozen motion even when you're shooting at f8 with a 2x teleconverter. Again, when these birds are flapping their wings, typically their heads are staying pretty still. Some nice sharpness in the eye here of the bird and the head of the bird, because the head wasn't really moving very far. And then the body's pretty still. The wings are already fully outstretched in the back, which is a point where they're pretty much stopped. And you can see there's a little bit of motion blur in the tips of the wings, but you're able to get a nice image here with the bird flapping its wings. Again, there is still a pretty good amount of light. The sun was still poking through. This is 500th of a second. One last thing I wanted to mention is just kind of talking about autofocus speed and how it reacted when using the teleconverters. So I kind of already mentioned this, but when using the 1.4 teleconverter, there was basically no difference compared to using the lens bare. With the advantage with the f2.8 aperture is you have so much light coming through your lens that your lens is really able to work quickly and autofocus quickly. And when adding the 1.4 teleconverter, you're then at f4, but I did not see any difference in speed for autofocusing or tracking or anything like that. It was really responsive. I was really impressed. I tend to use kind of a small autofocus box and follow the subject with that box using animal detect or bird detect. So I'm already kind of limiting where the camera is looking for the subject, which helps. But in this instance, there was no difference when using the 1.4 teleconverter as far as focusing speed and tracking. When using the 2x teleconverter, we have, again, we're at f5.6, so we lose some light there. And there was maybe a slight decrease in speed of tracking for subjects. I didn't notice anything that would make or break me not using it, but there was maybe just a slight lag in tracking. But again, you get the advantage of having the subject larger in frame when using the 2x teleconverter in most cases. So you actually gain a little bit there. Your autofocus has a little bit easier time picking up the subject and tracking it in those instances. So there's kind of a decrease of light coming through, which usually slows down autofocus. But when you use the 2x teleconverter to kind of make your subject larger in frame when you're already close to the subject, which is the main benefit of this, you're kind of gaining the advantage of having the subject larger in your viewfinder. So your autofocus is going to have a much more responsive time to tracking that subject. The autofocus for the OM1 Mark II is really good for birds and wildlife, and there's definitely no decrease in the speed and tracking when you're using the teleconverters. In my instance, I'm sure there might be some more tests out there where you can see a millisecond difference. Real world, there's not much of a difference. You can get good results with either one of these combinations for sure. Basically, the 50 to 200 millimeter lens is a fantastic lens. Okay, you can get some really great results all the way from 50 to 200 millimeters, either with the lens bare or when using the teleconverters. You get phenomenal results with the 1.4 teleconverter, especially at f4. It's just phenomenal sharpness there. It brings the lens up to about a 560 millimeter lens, so you can really get nice and close to subjects. And when using the 2x teleconverter, you can still get, as we saw in the real world examples, some good results at f5.6, but I found that you get the best results when you stop it down to about f8. Now, I still wouldn't hesitate to use that 2x teleconverter if I needed to, but the biggest thing to remember is if you're always going to be constantly needing to add the 2x teleconverter to this lens, it may be better to reach for a different lens with a native focal length that's a little bit farther. For instance, my 150 to 400 millimeter lens, I'm definitely going to be reaching for that one if I need to get to the 400 millimeter focal length, because you just get so much more sharper images with that lens compared to this lens. Now I know there's going to be a lot in the comments saying, well, you only compared it to the lens that's basically the pro lens, the 150 to 400 millimeter lens. And I'm sorry about that. That's the lens that I use. That's the lens that I have available to me. If you want me to compare it to other lenses, I'd be happy to do that. Let me know in the comments which lenses you'd want me to compare it to. Obviously, you could compare it to the 100 to 400 millimeter lens or the 300 millimeter f4 lens. There's multiple lenses out by OM System that you could compare the equivalent focal lengths of this lens with Teleconverters to, but I only have the 150 to 400 millimeter to compare it to. So if that's something you're interested in seeing or hearing about, let me know what lenses you'd like, and maybe I can arrange that for a future video. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope it was helpful. I hope it kind of filled in some of the content gaps from other videos. If it did, give me a thumbs up. Let me know. Give me a like. If you haven't yet subscribed and you like the content that's coming out on this channel, please consider subscribing. It's a free way to show your support. It really helps me gain a greater audience. And leave a comment if this was helpful. I really appreciate that as well. It again is a free way for you to show your support and helps this video get more reach to hopefully get new viewers to this channel. Also, I have my newsletter on my website. Please consider signing up for that. I've been very negligent in writing blog posts in basically this whole year, but coming into the new year, I plan on releasing blog posts at least once a month on different topics, from wildlife behavior, wildlife ecology, camera gear and techniques, and that sort of thing. So I'm already writing some blog posts now that are going to be released in the next year. So if you want to subscribe to my newsletter for those upcoming blog posts, please consider to do so. I have the link down below in my description for the video down below. And also don't forget, you can also join this channel now for memberships, channel memberships. It's a cheap way to just really show your support. It doesn't cost you much, just about a little bit of around the price of a cup of coffee. And I really appreciate those members who have joined. It means a lot to me. We're starting to get a nice community with those channel members as well. So thank you so much. I hope this was helpful for you, and I will see you again really soon. Thank you so much for watching.